Hey everybody. Let's see. We're moving into week 7 and getting close to spring break. Don't think anybody can wait. At least nobody in this room can wait. In any event, let's talk about last week. Talked about the police and the and patrol and traffic ops. Um, a lot of good things for you to consider in that chapter. The PowerPoint went a little bit different direction than the book itself, so make sure that you're aware of what's in both, both areas, especially when it comes to the idea of urgency. I'm sorry, when it comes to the idea of how resources are deployed and how that decision is made. And, unfortunately, most agencies will make that decision based on uh, geographic barriers as opposed to workload. Your workload studies are really expensive to do and take a ton of work. So you often don't see those within a police agency to better develop boundaries so that work is spread out to all different officers. And generally, you will have in a city, you'll have a really slow area, a really busy area, and then an area that is, or areas that kind of fall in the middle as far as workload goes. And you can kind of tell who the officers are that drift to different areas. In community policing, officers usually stay in an area for up to a year. Um, so, once you select an area, you're going to be there for a while. So all that being said, let's talk a little bit about the discussion board. Here's what I wanted you to get out of that was that the professional model had really easy objective measures of performance: arrest citations, field contacts, reports written, traffic collisions investigated. Very, very simple stats that allowed a supervisor to look at those stats and determine whether or not that officer was working, how much work they were producing, and whether or not that was in areas that would impact crime problems or traffic problems. A couple of discussion pieces or threads that were mentioned. One of you talked about seeing people doing actually consuming drugs in front of a church, and a couple of units sitting nearby, and they were laughing back and forth and talking about something unrelated. And consider that as to whether or not it's a matter of the officers just being lazy. We have to, if we assume that they saw what was going on, didn't tell them they were paying a lot of attention, but, were they lazy? Or is this kind of a manifestation of the idea of community policing and doing what people think is important? Really interesting, concept. I mean, it should give you some thought there. And how do we know people don't think that drug abuse is something that needs to be dealt with? Well, the voters have legalized marijuana, and now the legislature has at least one statute that's interesting when it comes to this discussion. And what that says that if a person who has taken a dangerous drug, illegal drug, like heroin, and overdoses and calls for assistance, they can't be arrested for using the drug, being under the influence, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, maybe it should mitigate it in court, but does it give that person a consequence beyond the overdose that maybe will have that person start to reconsider his relationship with drugs. I don't know. Another interesting um, post came from a student that was wondering why the police basically were out writing traffic tickets when they should be out, doing other more important things, which is a common refrain you hear from people. So, the thing to think about there is if, you're driving to work and somebody blows a red light because they're pretty sure the cops aren't going to give them a ticket or even stop them, and that person crashes into you, how important is that? Um, for you, for your boss, for your coworkers, if you're either a no-show or you're late. And then we can take it a step further and say that same person blows a red light, hits your car, and kills you. Now we're at a little higher societal level of victimization because of the fact that roadways aren't safe. The people around you that are mourning your loss or their loss of you. All those things are all things to be considered too. So those are kind of some of the things I was hoping you'd see out of this. Oh, and then the idea of community-oriented policing, getting back to this idea of productivity. In community-oriented policing, we want officers involved in contacts with the public, with meetings with the public. And I didn't really do it, but I always thought a good way to, if a person was looking to get promoted, and that was supposed to be the ethic of the department, then maybe going to a shopping center, a strip mall, going into each of the businesses, chatting up the owners or managers or workers, leaving a business card, all those things to make that connection, and then that connection would then get back to your boss, and would be when there's vague measures of productivity for officers, then how does that work? You're gonna. I know in my old agency had my chief heard that a person was well thought of by the community. That would have been an important part of any promotional process. That discussion. So all things to think about. Now let's move on to our current chapter. And I think I said 7 earlier, I apologize. Last week was 8, halfway there, and now we're at 9 with the search and seizure. First off, let's talk about the written assignment. Read the instructions. Follow the instructions. Don't be taken off the path, by superficial research into it. People lose a ton of points on this assignment. You've done it before, and they just don't follow directions, and then they're a little bit stunned later when it turns out that they get graded for following directions. So make sure you do that. Now, for the purposes of a video, this is a tough one because I love this stuff. Search and seizure, the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment. That's where my scholarship is in the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment. And you have other instructors that you'll probably take for criminal law and criminal procedure that are equally as passionate about it. But if you're going into law enforcement, start to pay attention here and kind of see how it's laid out. And then when you get into 340, 350, really pay attention. Most officers make mistakes in search and seizure, not because the law is so vague and there's so many rules and so hard to follow. They make mistakes in search and seizure because they're lazy, and they know if they stop a car and they arrest somebody and they tow the car, they can search the car. Well, great, and that's true. But there's other ways that the police can gain entry into a vehicle to do a search. And knowing those ways, knowing each of the rules, makes it so much easier for you, because you can evaluate search and seizure problems fairly quickly and with a pretty good amount of accuracy, and keep yourself out of trouble. Um, an example of an officer that got into trouble. It was a minor issue, but it still required discipline, and it had surfaced as a complaint. So what had happened was the officer goes to a house. There was a report of a hit and run accident. License plate was recovered. They run the license plate, and it comes back to a residence. They get to the residence, knock on the door, and a child answers, 8, 9 years old. They ask if mom's home. The driver was described as a female. Kid says, yeah, mom's home, upstairs, asleep, doesn't want to be bothered. So we really need to get her. And they go back and forth, and the kid doesn't go get mom. So as the officer standing looking at the door, to the left is another door which goes into the garage. It's that kind of interior garage door entry. So the officer sticks his head inside the door, just his head, looks over, sees the hit and run vehicle in the garage. And then that leads to getting mom up and all kinds of other stuff. Well, mom complains and says, wait a minute, that was an entry into the residence, without a warrant, consent, or exigency. Certainly an 8-year-old could not consent to a search, and the 8-year-old wasn't even asked for consent for that matter. So the officer ended up being disciplined for it. When officers, I should say, start to try to figure out ways around problems, they, get into more difficulty. One of those, problems that occurs when, as an example, is officer goes to report of a hit and run accident and finds a sign knocked down. The sign was knocked down, and there was radiator fluid. They follow it to a parking lot in front of a house they had big parties at. So they go to the door, knock on the door, ask for the owner of the vehicle, and nobody is helpful. They write in the report that they were concerned that the person had sustained injuries in a collision, so they went past the person into the residence, looked through the party, found the person, and of course they were DUI. Well, the question becomes, did they have probable cause, a pretty high level of proof required to make that entry? And the answer is no, they didn't. The officer ended up, there was some more shenanigans that were involved in this, and the officer ended up getting fired. Huge, and as they take the person out of the party, it erupts into this big, huge brawl, and they got a call for multiple additional units, and the rest, just on and on and on. So it was a bad deal. Again, not following the easy rules. So, all that being said, this week, you're going to be looking at the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment. The way I've broken it down is into a search and seizure area. The search and seizure area is broken down into major topics. Those would be searches of persons, searches of buildings, including residences, searches of vehicles, and specialized searches. So as you look through the PowerPoint, that should give you a framework. Now, here's the hint for you. If you're going into law enforcement or even going to law school, I'd take some notes from that under those categories I just talked about and note some of the cases. If you know some of those cases, and then you'll see The order that things are approached in 350 is a little bit different. But when you're going to sit for the bar and you get a search and seizure question for an essay, you'll be able to break it out right from this simple stuff. Because then of course I always go for some bizarre case or fact pattern, but you'll know search and seizure fairly well. So with searches and seizures, within those categories, each category has different ways to search. As an example, searches of persons. You can search a person with a warrant, consent, or exigency, meaning the warrant has been issued that allows for the search of that person. And that might be something like obtaining a breath sample or a blood sample for DUI. And consent, remember, a person can consent to give up their constitutional rights, any one of them, whether it's the right to counsel at trial, whether it's the prohibition against unreasonable searches and seizures. And then the exigency, an emergency. Going to law enforcement, I'd kind of look at it from the standpoint of a life-threatening emergency or a felony. So you walk up to the front door and misdemeanor DUI, and bad guy's standing inside the door, or a drunk guy. And let's say it's a similar fact pattern as the party. Person hits something, knocks a sign down, or park cars or whatever, nobody's injured, drives home, you follow the damage laying all over the street back to the house, go knock on the front door, person opens the door and is standing inside the threshold, out of your reach, or even in your reach, and refuses to come out. Don't go in and get them. Unless that's the ethic of your department. And it very well might be, but I think you write the report, you note the objective symptoms of intoxication, and you can do some creative stuff maybe to get them out of the house, but don't go in and grab the guy because it's not a life-threatening emergency or serious felony. Compare that to you go to the door, knock on the door at a party, they being people inside, open the door, and on the table in front of you is a pound of methamphetamine. Serious felony. Make entry, secure the contraband, make the scene safe, get everybody to stop, and then go get your warrant to search the rest of the house. So, warrant, consent, exigency, you can search a person. You can also search a person when they've been arrested under a lawful arrest. If there is the potential that you're going to find contraband related to that arrest. So a person gets arrested for being under the influence of methamphetamine, you can search them for meth and paraphernalia, that kind of a thing. Pretty new case, past 5 years or so, Gant, Arizona versus Gant, but that's a good one to know. You can search a person if you're taking them into custody for jail security. So you've got those, and then you can also do what's known as a booking search, and that would be a search at the custody facility as they're being booked. 6 ways to search a person. Then you look at residences or buildings, just 3, warrant, consent, exigency, and all the cases fall off of one of those 3. Was it truly an emergency? Really, really interesting case, which I love some of counsel's arguments. Cops get called to a party call, and of course they get there, they're standing at the front door, and they see suspect just drill some other guy in the face, punch him out. The guy goes down. So they go and force entry above the objections of the people in the party. And of course they're objecting for good reason because there's contraband, there's drugs in the kitchen where the fight is. They break up the fight, they get the EMS for the knockdown guy, and make some arrests. So there's a motion to suppress, which um, the judge rules against, and they appeal, and they say that no, it was only a fight. It wasn't a life-threatening emergency. And okay, just because the guy went to the ground doesn't mean that it was life-threatening. They didn't have sufficient, and of course you can see what kind of I'll call it a lame argument that is. So that's what you have for residences. Warrant, consent, exigency. Moving on to vehicles. Vehicles, there's 7 ways to search a vehicle. Warrant, consent, exigency. And then others that the PowerPoint goes into. And I at least have a rudimentary idea of what those are. The special searches, and that's that idea of probation, parole searches, highly regulated businesses. Examples are businesses that deal with explosives, bars, places that deal with alcohol, and then a kind of a subset of that would be auto repair kind of places. Those are highly regulated businesses. So we then move on to the Fifth Amendment, and that's going to be all of your admissions, confessions stuff. And as you look at that, kind of understand that basic idea of Miranda. The biggest thing you got to figure out from Miranda is that idea of custody. And that's kind of opening up a little bit, because the test used to be, that if a person looking at the plight of the defendant would think that they were under arrest if they were in that same position, then you had custody. It's kind of changed a little bit now, but take a look and kind of go through that, and that will get you back to seizures of persons. When do we have custody? And I've seen more and more deals where guys get put in handcuffs, thrown in the back of a police car. Now, a really good safety way, because you're not likely to get assaulted by the guy in the back of the car if he's handcuffed, even though he's not under arrest. And of course, what cops love to say, which just cracks me up, those handcuffs come off as easily as they go on. I find that a hoot. It's a hoot. Never use that line. I might have maybe later in my career as I was teaching this, because I found it so funny. So with admissions, confessions, then you're talking about kind of the location of the discussion. Is it a custodial interrogation, which is the key issue to that? And then Sixth Amendment stuff. And then there's other issues that are talked about in the PowerPoint on the Fifth Amendment. And then the Sixth Amendment are, the things like right to counsel and say right to counsel, speedy trial. I believe there's 4. I can't come off the top of my head right now, but 4 areas within the Sixth Amendment that you should be aware of, and be aware of this stuff for the midterm, or the next exam, which comes up next week, and then also be aware of those things if you're going into law enforcement, and you can kind of flesh those out a little bit more, especially in 350. Because, like I said, 350 is going to be taught the way the books are written now. I don't like the way books are written now, because they kind of jump around, and they'll deal with maybe search incident to a lawful arrest, and then the different times that you can use that, or that is at play in a detention or an arrest, and it's not very clean. So you can kind of expect to see those things. And I'm trying to give you a little bit shorter video, and it doesn't appear like I'm doing a very good job. I'm so sorry. So with that, the other thing that is really important for you is the initial stuff that we talk about in the PowerPoint this week, the purpose of the Constitution. You know, people immediately say, and the vast majority of my classes say, well, the idea is to protect the rights of the people. That's what the Constitution is about. And that couldn't be more incorrect. As a matter of fact, it's to lay out the powers of the federal government, regardless of what those things are for the people. So be really aware of that. That is a point that is frequently discussed in this course, and people kind of miss that idea. It's an important idea. The second major thing, which I harp on, you hear constantly about the rule of law. And, I've given you a quote for the rule of law for you to really take a look at and understand. And that's that governmental authority is only legitimately exercised in accordance with written, publicly disclosed laws and enforced in accordance with well-established procedures. So what that means is governmental authority, meaning telling you what you can and can't do on a daily basis, is only legitimately utilized by the government, forcing you to respond to laws that are passed by legislatures and in Congress. Kind of funny though, because there is so much law now that is done administratively that never sees the halls of Congress or state assemblies. It is done by I'll sorry for the editorial comment here. It's done by fiat by somebody who was appointed to a position, and they think that it's to better run their position. That's the way they got to do it. So then the second half of that is enforced in accordance with well-established procedures. That's the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment. The federal government, the government has to abide by the Fourth, Fifth, and then Sixth Amendment. And if they don't, then the accused has the right to not be brought to trial. So, with all that being said, and I'll try to get you out here a little bit early, and it's not going to be much. And again, I apologize, but I love this stuff. This stuff is so important, especially for law school people, future prosecutors, future defense attorneys, and then people that are going to be out there driving around in a hack, meaning beat cops. You got to know this stuff, and it's so much easier to comply with it. Don't look to not comply because you know some way around the law. The best example that I can give to you is Missouri versus Siebert, S-I-E-B-E-R-T. If you want some really interesting facts, take a look at that case. It's a U.S. Supreme Court case. It hinges on the fact that a detective was trained by an attorney who was trying to give them tips on how to get around the Fourth Amendment. And of course, it backfired severely. Okay, that being said, I think that's the fourth time I've said that, so I've got to learn to stop saying that. With all that, I will see you all in class.